Welcome to this topic video on CSS Layout. This is an overview of layout, okay, and a bit about the history of layout. Okay, we're going to get into specific layouts in separate slide decks, okay? So we're going to learn about the history of CSS layout. We're going to learn more about the CSS display property, and we're going to understand and use the CSS float property for its intended purpose. It's been used for other things in the past. Okay, so I recommend these readings from MDN. Okay, and for further information, see the All About Float from CSS Tricks and more. I think I've recommended this before. Invisible CSS. Good, important, in-depth look at important CSS concepts. Okay. So CSS layout techniques, this is from MDN, okay, allow us to take elements contained in the web page and control where they are positioned relative to their default position in normal layout flow, okay, with respect to the other elements around them, with respect to their parent container or the main viewport window. Now, we've already seen CS positioning, so we've seen how to do some of this, okay. Now, normal flow, we saw before, elements appear one below the other are described as block elements. In contrast, inline elements which appear besides each other, like the individual words in a paragraph. So we've learned about normal flow, okay? To change the flow, okay, we have to do something, okay? It just doesn't happen, okay? HTML, otherwise, it's laid out in the exact order it appears according to this layout algorithm, right? What do we have to change the flow? Okay, we've learned about position for changing the flow. Now we're going to learn about float and display, though we have used display just a teeny tiny bit maybe in the homeworks to turn things completely off. Okay, we use display none, maybe in the homeworks, maybe not. Depends on which homeworks I assigned and which things I showed you. Okay. For perspective, okay, here's a question for getting perspective. How long have grids been used in page layout? Okay. Think about it. Okay. If I said page layout, if I expanded to what I meant by a page, like a book page, or a newspaper page, or an advertising page, okay, grid systems, whether they were called that formally or not, have been used since the origin of writing and drawing. The idea that you put a frame around something counts as a grid system, okay? Our box model might be considered kind of a classic grid system, right? Okay. This approach of grid systems is used by designers today for web pages, apps, and graphical user interfaces of all sorts, okay? There are various, maybe I should say, techniques or methods to create these grid systems, okay? What do I mean? There's a grid of boxes where you can put content, okay? We're going to see that, okay? The earliest HTML grids, or earliest grids used in the web, were an abuse of tables. In class and in the homeworks, we've used HTML tables for displaying tabular data, right? Rows and columns of data. That's what it's the purpose of table. That's what you're supposed to use table for. Then you can style those tables. They weren't intended for use as a grid system where you put some things in certain squares. However, in the early days of the web, that's all folks had. So there are a lot of stupid table tricks that people figured out so they could try and put things the way they wanted them. Okay? This approach has been abandoned. You will not use that in this class, nor should you be using it anywhere in the web nowadays. It's got many issues. It's not the reason to use tables. An alternative that came after this was getting kicked out was float-based grids. At least this was based on CSS standards and not abusing something from HTML. Okay, so this was standards based, but not optimal. We're going to see the real reason for using floats at the end of this presentation. Okay. Today, we've got two different tools that you can use separate and together to do all sorts of great layouts. Okay. One is called Flexbox. Okay. And this allows you to lay out elements along either a horizontal or a vertical reference line. Grid layouts, on the other hand, is a real two-dimensional layout. So a two-dimensional grid gives you lots of control about the rows and the columns, their sizing, if things get to go in multiple boxes, etc., etc. Okay, full functionality. You can use it in many different ways. Okay, we'll illustrate two of those in our grid lecture. One is real quick and easy that we use when we lay out, what I use all the time when I lay out forms. The other is more for page layout, and there's everything in between. Okay. So we're going to learn about float coming up. So what is the CSS? We've done position, the CSS position property when we did our positioning, CSS positioning. So what is this display property? Okay. We've used it a little bit. The type of rendering box used for an element. Okay. So we've had display block, display inline block. Okay. Those are the kind of things we've done, or display inline. Okay. We've done that. Okay. Block, inline, inline block. Okay. We want to change the default layout properties of an element. Like a paragraph defaults to block. Okay. An image actually defaults to inline. A span defaults to inline. Okay. We've seen changing a span to inline block so we could set the width on it. Okay. But there are new choices. Okay. Two key new choices. Display flex sets up that element as a container, a flex box container. Okay, so it's not going to tell that element itself how to lay itself out relative to other things. It's going to be specing what happens within the container. Okay, same with display grid. Okay, we're going to choose some element, we're going to tell it to be grid, and then we get to use and specify how everything within that element get laid out. It's really nice, and like I said, many different ways we can use it. Two main things I use it for, again, overall page layout, and for laying out a bunch of controls. Okay, lots of nice properties. One more thing, we've seen it before, display none. Okay, what does display none do? I've got a bunch of style sheets associated here. So what would happen, do you think, if I go body, and I come over here and I set the display property to none? Yeah, nothing gets displayed. I go back to block, comes back, right? Go back to none. Okay, and we've used this, or maybe we've used this for some effects. Okay, to turn things off, to hide things. Okay, so display none, very useful. Okay, so we're not going to do flex and grid yet. Those are separate talks, but we are going to talk about floats. Okay, floats originally were introduced to allow web developers to implement simple layouts involving images floating alongside a column of text with text wrapping around it, like you'd see in a newspaper. Okay, so here's an example. This is what here, style. I'm going to say Style something with an ID foil, give it a width of 40%, float it to the left. Okay. Oh, here we go. The image here, IMG, gets the ID foil, so we're going to restrict the width of this image, and we're going to tell it to float. Okay, then we have a bunch of paragraph stuff. It's longer than just this. Okay, let's see what this does. Okay. Oh, is this really true, Professor? Yes, it is. Let's take a look at what's going on here. We're going to go come here. We're going to click. So we're going to click. We're going to click here. We're going to see image foil. Okay. And we're going to see down here, I don't need zero selections, this element, it's got width set and float set. If I turn off the float, oh, it's no longer side by side. Okay. Turn off the width, it takes up all the space anyhow. Okay. Nice effect. It would be even nicer if the stuff actually wrapped around top and bottom. We'll see more examples of that coming up, okay, in our little practice. Okay. All right. So what does this do? The element with the float set on it is taken out of the normal layout flow of the document and stuck to the left if we set the float to left, or to the right if we set the float to right, hand side of its parent container. Okay, so this was relative to its parent container. We sold it. Okay, so the parent is containing all this stuff. Okay. Any content that comes after the float element in the normal layout will now wrap around it, filling up the space to the right-hand side as far up as the top of the floated element. Ah, so this stuff goes around to the top of the floated element. What happens if we shrink it? Ooh, look at that. It does really wrap around. Nice looking, except this looks like it's been centered because that's probably the default styling here. You don't usually use centered text with floating, but such is life. Okay, so it wraps around, filling the space. That's a newspaper-like effect. Okay, we got some float practice here to try out. Okay, float one of the images to the left and one to the right. Do we need to modify other properties for this to work? Does it always look good? Those are the questions. Let's open this up in a new tab. Float practice. Oh, same image. Oh, and look at this. We've got a lot of blabber text. Okay, I use this in one of our other examples. This was generated by a blabber text generator, also known as a Lorem Ipsum generator. So let's just try this the easy peasy way. Okay, so let's come here and select the image element. Okay, there's that image element, and down further there's another version of that image. Okay, another copy of that image. So we're going to try, what did I say? Float the one to the left. So float left. Oops. Okay, absolutely no effect. Why not? Because it's so big. It takes up all the space. Okay? This paragraph stuff is not that big. Okay? So maybe I should set the width to something, I don't know, 70% of its container? Ooh, look at that. It's floating around now. Okay. What about maybe 60% of the container? Okay. Now we see it doesn't do a lot of wraparound here. It all depends on our container. Okay. It could even. Okay. Gee. So the guy below him is this paragraph. Let's clean that up a little bit. Let's go padding 0.5 em. that do anything? There, but not here. Interesting. Let's go back to the image. Let's see if we can add some padding to this guy. Padding 1M. So it's not 1ml. 1m. Okay, so that is giving me, it's giving me some nice looking stuff, but this guy now seems too wide. So what are we discovering here? To make this stuff looks good, take some effort, extra effort. I might even shrink this even more because we want it to wrap around nicely, but we don't want them right in each other and stuff like that. So you're going to play with your padding, your width, and things like that. I recommend probably to use, since I set these widths in terms of M units, I would probably use M units here rather than percent units. Okay, let's go down and try out this other image. Okay. Okay, now this is actually in a section called Blabber More. Okay, so I could, if I wanted to go and do this via a style sheet. Okay, so here's this internal style sheet. Okay, if I wanted to select that guy, I could go class selector more img and say float right. Okay, but yeah, he's definitely pushed to the right, but there's no room for things because his width isn't set. Now blabber, if I recall, blabber body blabber blah blah blah. We'll set this in terms of a width, 20m. Okay, that's not bad looking. Let's set some padding, 1m. What's an M again? Okay, an M is the size. Collaborate. Okay, so it wraps around. Okay, let's make him a little shorter. Okay, not bad looking. We're not seeing much wraparound though. So, okay, cool. That's not bad. Nicely floated. Okay. So we had to actually change multiple things. Okay, so we changed the setting to float. Okay, this guy was floated to the left. This other one I selected by saying, oh, this is in this other place. Floating him to the right, I had to restrict the width of this image, otherwise it took up all the space available. Right? But this is 100%, takes up 100% of his container width. Okay, these, what did we like? We like 18M. Okay, that looks something more reasonable. Okay, so you've got other things you've got to set to get this float effect working. Is the float effect what you're trying to do? If you are trying to set up something, it may be, or it may be not. It all depends on what you're trying to achieve. Okay, that's 22. That one really doesn't work. It's too big, too wide. A little bit nicer. Okay. Now, will you always use floats? You know, if you're just trying to get a block here and a block here, that's actually a more a case for Flexbox or grid. Okay. If you're really going for the wraparound effect, that's what you want to use floats for. Okay. So that's our introduction to CSS Layout. And we'll be following up with Flexbox and Grid in coming lectures.